Okay, so we pick up from our last episode. What do we know by now about evolution? Evolution behavior is not for the good of the species. We saw group selection, Marlon Perkins, Wynne Edwards, the scientist who pushed that, trounced in the 60s with individual selection instead. Selfish gene concept. Sometimes the chicken is an egg's way of making another egg. We saw the critical transition to kin selection. Sometimes you can enhance your reproductive success by leaving lots of copies of your genes in the next generation. Sometimes it works instead to help relatives do that. And as a function of relatedness, I'll lay down my life for two brothers or eight cousins, explaining the complete crazed obsession social animals have the world over with kinship. Who do you compete with? Who do you cooperate with? Who do you nurse? Who do you mate with? Things of that sort. Kinship, kin selection. Then we move to our transitional form, Greenbeards, which is kind of a poor man's version of kin selection. Rather than cooperating with someone because they share half your genes with you, something like that, all you need is one conspicuous gene. A gene that makes you conspicuous with your green beard, that makes them conspicuous and allows you to recognize them, and allows the two of you to cooperate with each other. That transitioned us to our third great pillar, reciprocal altruism. Sometimes it makes sense to cooperate with somebody, even if they are not a relative. Cooperative behavior enhances stuff synergistically in lots of cases, and thus you want to find cooperative relationships with other individuals as long as they're going to reciprocate. And once that's established, the thing you really, really, really want to do in life is to be able to cheat. And what they really want to do is the same thing, unless you really, really, really want to have good detection means of seeing if somebody is cheating you. And thus, this complex issue, when should you cheat, when you should cooperate, in leading us into our world of game theory, prisoner's dilemma. We saw how tit for tat is the optimal strategy in prisoner's dilemma. And we see a key thing about it, which is it is great, it is clear, it starts off being cooperative, it's willing to punish you if you're a jerk, it's willing to forgive you if you go back to being nice, all of that. And in a normal scenario, it will drive always cheat into extinction. What we then saw was as long as there's a problem, a possibility of signal error, you can get really, really messed up forever with tit for tat by a signal error making you think you've been cheated against, and thus you cheat, and thus they cheat, and you scallop all the way down into maladaptiveness, forgiving tit for tat, which is basically a formalized way of saying if you trust this individual, if you've had enough rounds of cooperation, you will assume at some point that this was a signal error to break that cycle. So, what we got to at the end was seeing some examples of tit for tat behavior out in actual species out there, sticklebacks and vampire bats, and there's black hamlet fish, which when we get to the sex lectures, we're going to be hearing a bit more about them, in that they are one of about 600 fish species that change sex depending on social circumstance, and you will get these pair of fish who keep switching back and forth in a reciprocally altruistic relationship with breeding cycles as to who's the female and who's the male. And then they switch, and then they switch. And why should they want to switch? Because being the female is more expensive metabolically, and we'll be looking at that in more detail. But that winds up being a reciprocal relationship, and a few people have argued that you have circumstances where somebody cheats by trying to stay as a male longer. The next time around, they are cheated against in the other direction. Okay, we also finished up beginning to see the real world reality, which is there's more than one game going on that you're a participant in at a time. And we saw the cowardly lion scenario, the strange business about Sometimes you see all those lions, a speaker in the bushes there, a playback experiment, the sound of a scary lion. All these lionesses go running in to investigate. Nice share, except you will notice one individual who's behind. Why do they put up with her? Why don't they drive her out of the pride? Cheating on there, and then it turns out she's the most effective hunter. Ah, you are figuring out reciprocity in your relationships across a few different circumstances. Now, this gave rise to like one of the most heartbreaking discoveries I've made, which was about a week ago, and that for years I thought I remembered this study correctly, and I remembered it incorrectly. You sort of make these assumptions, and then you discover things like, no, it's two kidneys and one heart rather than the other way around. This one concerned what I always thought was the case with naked mole rats. Naked mole rats, they live underground. All of them are busy as beavers, keeping their colony tube tunnels open and all sorts of other tasks. And researchers would see there's a subset, about 5% of these worker naked mole rats didn't work. They just sat around. They just sat around and ate, and they were relatively heavier compared to all the other naked mole rats. And why is everybody putting up with that? And what I thought, this is so embarrassing that this is what I thought for years until I went back to the paper. I thought the secret thing that they were actually good for, that they were tolerated for, that they were fed and pampered for, was during the rainy seasons, when it started flooding, that they were so big they could waddle up to the entrance to their colony and plug the hole with their rear ends to keep water from coming in. I don't know why I thought I had read this 25 years ago. It turns out what they're there for is when times get bad, they've got the reserves to go out and start a long journey to try to find a new site. So they don't save the colony with their rear ends. They save the colony this way instead. But again, the main point being, as soon as you start getting to things as complicated as mole rats and lions, oh, their social world involves more than one prisoner's dilemma game going on at once. And we'll eventually be seeing, by the time you get to us, some of these strange cognitive things we do in mixing and bleeding over cooperation in one realm into another where there is not, or the other, in which circumstance is which more likely to happen. We'll be getting there in the aggression lectures. Okay, so all of this is wonderful. Get a nice cooperative system, be on guard against cheaters, teach when you can. All of it is great. But then the field faces this gigantic problem, which we alluded to the other day, which is, so how do you start a cooperative system? How do you jumpstart reciprocal altruism? Because it's clear in a world in which everybody's a cheater, nobody cooperates, and you sit there and you've read all about, utopian and anarchism and things of that sort. So I'm going to start cooperating with everybody, and you're screwed. You're up the creek because you have started off cooperating where nobody else is, and you were immediately behind in the tally there. How do you ever get cooperation to start in a population whose starting state is nobody cooperates? And people have done a lot of work trying to figure this out, and we will get to this in more detail in the aggression lectures on how do you stop aggression, how do you foster peace, what are the mechanisms for that. But at least two models have dominated people's thinking. First one, you already know in effect what this one is, which is you have Greenbeards conveniently in red here. You've got a population of nothing but cheaters, and then there's these two Greenbeards, and they cooperate with each other. The critical thing. You are up the creek if you are a cooperator. You are in great shape if there's two of you, and you have a means to recognize each other. And that's what the Greenbeardness is about. So the two of them recognize each other and they start cooperating. And by all of our prisoner's dilemma stuff, what you wind up seeing is they're going to outcompete everybody else. How come? A soundbite about tit for tat. Tit for tat may lose the battle, but it wins the war. It may lose the battle in that a nice cooperator, when they interact with someone who's a cheater, they're going to wind up behind. They're going to lose that battle. But as long as they could find each other, and most importantly, as long as they can preferentially interact with each other, they are going to slowly drive all the non-cooperators into extinction. Into extinction, a term that game theory people would use in terms of different strategies being driven to extinction. Now, this metaphor, now that we're thinking about living stuff in biology, is not that much of a metaphor. These guys are going to drive all the non-cooperators out of business. And what do you wind up seeing? They have no choice. They have no choice. These non-cooperators who go to their graves, that lots of non-cooperators have to take on cooperation. Greenbeard effects is one driving force. Okay, so there was a fantastic example of this. I remember back in the 80s, I was in New York City in grad school, and there was this gigantic controversy going on about the fruit and vegetable stands in Manhattan, which at the time were predominantly owned by Korean families. And they were out competing all the fruit and vegetable stands in Manhattan that were not owned by Koreans. And what was that about? This was even covered in the newspapers, New York Times. Those damn newcomers, they're doing something so sneaky and underhanded. They give each other interest-free loans because they're all part of the same community. And when that's done, they're acting as Greenbeards, and everybody else saying, oh my God, that's so unfair that they trust each other and they give each other interest-free loans to start their business. And what you saw was over the subsequent years, the rest of the fruit and vegetable stand community had to kick in with that also. You look at the Orthodox Jewish Diamond District in New York, and because of the same Greenbeard traits, people there make loans without interest to each other. They trust each other with, like, here, you can take this diamond home for the weekend and rub it against your face and decide if you want to buy it or not, and see you Monday. Ooh, Greenbeard effects when you have means for cooperators to spot each other. Everybody else is going to have to join in. Next model by which you jumpstart cooperation, and this is sort of an old population biology concept of, okay, you got a population here and unexpectedly a land bridge disappears or a mountain pops up in the middle of nowhere, and you suddenly have a population that's isolated, that's cut off from the main one, a founder population. And one of the cool things that happens there is things evolve quickly in small founder populations. And very relevant here, as their isolation continues, they're going to get more and more inbred. More and more, their average degree of relatedness is going to go up. More and more, there's going to be selection for them to get really cooperative with each other out of kin selection. So you've got the old population where everybody's going around being a cheater like everywhere, and you've got this founder population, and then one morning you get up and the whole mountain chain has collapsed overnight or a land bridge is formed or whatever, and the founder population gets integrated back into the main population. And we've got the exact same thing here again. You get these guys in the core cooperating, and the only thing that could happen is for everybody else, cooperation has to crystallize outward. Because as long as these guys have this core, this sort of crystallized center of cooperation there, even though they may lose battles being taken advantage of by these jerks, as long as there's a critical mass of them, and they can preferentially interact with each other, they're going to win the war, and everybody is going to have to switch over to that. So we will see lots more about that, but that's a central sort of challenge in the field. How do you jumpstart cooperation? And game theorists have been working with that for a long time. Where do sudden Greenbeard effects come in? This was sort of second generation game theory meets zoology. Computer scientist named John Holland, who I believe was the first person to ever get a PhD in computer science back in the 60s or something, introduced the notion of mutations. in game theory strategies where suddenly a trait can pop up. And we already know if some nice cooperative Greenbeard trait pops up mutationally in this guy, they are up the creek. They are screwed once again unless there happens to be two of them and they could find each other. Or unless there's a mechanism by which they already are preferentially interacting with each other. These are means by which it could happen. Okay, so what would reciprocal altruism look like in the context of natural selection? It would obviously take the form of like a bunch of you hunt cooperatively rather than individually. And you will see things like wild dogs, African Cape hunting dogs, hunt cooperatively in really brilliant ways. A number of them are chasing a prey, and just in case the prey turns this way or that way, a subset of them go diagonally and cut the corners so that they are waiting there. Chimps will do cooperative hunting as well, and that's okay. So that's reciprocal altruism going on there. What does reciprocal altruism look like in the context of sexual selection? I don't know, you're advising each other on how not to look silly when you go out on a date or some such thing, and as long as you do it reciprocally and don't cheat and take advantage of all of that. Okay, so we found this whole issue of how to jumpstart, and once it gets going, we could now have the full benefits of our third limb, reciprocal altruism, kin selection, individual selection. Now what we're going to focus on predominantly today is, so how does this look like? What does this look like? How does this explain all sorts of interesting aspects of animal behavior? When you apply our 3 pillars plus Greenbeardism, how does that make sense of behavior when at a point in the past people would have looked instead and said, oh, behaving for the good of the species, or who knows why these animals do this, it makes no sense at all, or whatever. How can we begin to make sense in the context of what we've been learning? And here is one of the fundamental realms in which all these principles play out. So you've got two different species, and just as our starting point, just arbitrarily, in one species, there is a high degree of sexual dimorphism, which is to say the body sizes differ a lot between females and males. And let's assume in this one, it goes in the direction of the dimorphism. Male body size is a lot bigger than female body size. And what you're likely to see along with that is secondary sexual characteristics in the males, big ridiculous plumage and antlers and sort of massive ways of displaying your studliness and all. So you've got a very sexually dimorphic species. And in contrast, here we have a species which has no sexual dimorphism. All body size is the same between the two. As we'll see with some examples, you can't even tell looking at them who's a male, who's a female. And as a result of that, or implicit in that, no secondary sexual characteristics. Okay, so now you begin to make predictions about what else you would see in the species like this one with a high dimorphism, the one without, and what you immediately wonder about is, well, in this species, these males are a lot bigger, they've got big sharp canines, they've got big muscle mass, all of that, and what does that suggest? What would be the logical thing if you're choosing between the sexually dimorphic and the undimorphic species? In which species do you think males are spending a lot of time fighting with each other? The dimorphic species, because a lot of what the secondary sexual characteristics are about is for either intimidating a potential male rival or sort of trouncing him in an actual combat sort of thing. And in contrast, in these low dimorphism, non-dimorphism species, you see very low levels of male-male aggression. That makes sense. Not surprisingly then, given that in these dimorphic guys, males are fighting at a much higher rate than here, you see males have a shorter life expectancy than the females do. In contrast, in this sort of species, you would expect to see the same lifespan. Males here dying of injuries, dying being killed by other males, injuries where they're hobbled up and a predator spots them and picks them off, or if they're just doing stupid stuff like secreting lots of testosterone, it'll clog up your arteries after a while. And like the male body is basically not designed for long life in a dimorphic species. Non-dimorphic, in a dimorphic, non-dimorphic, same lifespan as females on the average. So, we've now learned something about what you would expect. What else would you expect from these? Now, in one of these species, I'm presenting this as a big cliffhanger, even though the answers are already here. In one of these species, you would expect to see enormous amounts of variation in male reproductive success. As in, some guys leave lots of copies of their genes, a lot of guys never do. In contrast, the species where there would be very low variance of male reproductive. Everybody leaves one or two copies of their genes by way of reproducing. Which do you expect to see? Which, obviously here in this highly dimorphic species with lots of male-male aggression, males fighting for access to enhancing their individual fitness, for leaving copies. And what you see is huge variation between the most reproductively successful and least successful ones out there, and tremendous variance. So let me give you one example of this. Element seals. What you find is they are a highly dimorphic species. Males are a whole lot bigger than females. They've got these weird nose appendage things and they fight each other on the beach. And what you see is among these elephant seals, 5% of the males account for 95% of the mating. Tremendous variation there in reproductive success. In contrast, what you see in this kind of species is very low variation. Males, one or two kids, a few of them zero, whatever, versus the massive variance here. Okay, so what does this predict now about the behavior of such males? In one of these species, you are going to see if a male fathers someone, or if a male thinks he has fathered someone, stay tuned. If he fathers someone, he puts effort into being a father. He invests in male parental investment. He helps take care of kids. So, this one, any given male is at any given point the father of maybe one kid there, one or two kids. You see in these sorts of species high levels of male parental investment. And as we will see, actually higher levels than the females in many cases in terms of how many calories they're expending per day helping kids. In contrast, in these guys, you're that elephant seal who has 11 kids on the beach there, and you're not going to be paying any attention. I mean, you see no or very little male parental investment in this sort of species. So, now you are a female. A female, what are you looking for in a potential mate? This one, like, what help are you getting? You're going to get nothing from this guy. You mate with this guy, and he's long gone, and all he cares about is basically, are you willing to mate with him? That's his criterion. And what's your criterion? Since you're getting no help from him, nothing, all you're getting from him are sperm. So what females in species like this choose for, select for, are suggestions, markers that somebody has good sperm, that somebody has good genes, that somebody is healthy, that they don't have some sort of disease, that they're big, strapping, whatever. And thus you better bet sexual selection plays a huge role here. And when we get to these sex lectures, we're going to see that as such, there's been a lot of pressure evolutionarily for males to be able to lie about how actually wonderful their genes are. False advertising in terms of sexual selection. And what females have to be really good at is spotting males who legitimately have good genes, because that's all you're getting from them. In contrast, in these species, these low dimorphism species, what you see is, what are females choosing for? They're choosing for males who are going to be competent parents, who are going to be Good fathers, you're choosing for males who are kind of like females in terms of their skills at this kind of thing. You're not choosing for some guy who's 3 times the size of you. You want somebody who's non-dimorphic, who you really can't tell the difference between them. And there are some of these species where you cannot tell the sex until you start poking around in their privates. What are they looking for? They're looking for a male who's going to do a reasonably good job at acting like a mother. And what you see in these species are all sorts of courtship displays by males demonstrating what a good father they're going to be. You get bird courtship displays where the male comes and gets a worm and comes and presents it to the female. Look what I'm able to do. Look at my earning potential. All of that female choice is built around males giving signals that if they're going to be involved in the parenting, that they're going to be competent. In contrast here, all the females are looking for are markers of good genes, and thus all the males are trying to be doing is lying about how great their genes are, lying about what sort of external markers there are that reflect their health, their genetics, things of that sort. By the way, as long as we're in this here, what are males looking for? Males in this case are also being picky. They're also being highly selective because whoever it is they mate with, if she gives birth to a kid in these species, you are going to stick around and do like a huge percentage of the work from that point. You want to find a female who, for example, has already had a kid and raised the kid to maturity, things of that sort. You want to have, what's the best way of doing that? Stick around. And what you see in these species is you get stable pair bonds, you get stable monogamy going on in these ones. And in contrast, what's he looking for? He's looking for anyone who's going to mate with him, and he doesn't care who and what. And you see highly polygamous, polyandrous systems here. These are pair bonders. These are monogamous organisms where they form mates for life. We will eventually see in one of the most celebrated versions of sort of pair bonding in a rodent species. Turns out they're socially monogamous, but they're not all that sexually monogamous. We will eventually get to those. But what we're beginning to see here is the picture of this is what pair bonding is about. This is what monogamous species, males and females, look roughly the same because they're being selected for the same thing. Parental investment capacity. That's what a female is looking for in a male. A male is much more choosy because he's going to have a big investment here. Little male aggression. All the males reproduce a couple of times on the average, and in contrast, this very different picture here. So we've got big differences as soon as we have a pair bonding species. For any given pregnancy, how many different males is a female likely to have mated with? Just one. We'll see not always just one, but something approximating one. In contrast, if you were a female here, you were likely to have mated with a whole bunch of different guys when you get pregnant. What does that mean for the guys? They try to mate as much as possible. They try to leave as many sperm in there as possible. And what you see is in species like this, the relative size of the testes compared to the rest of the body much greater than in these species because you're cranking out tons of sperm. You have more sperm being made. You have a higher density of them in each ejaculate there. You see totally cool stuff when you have these species where sperm from multiple males are competing after mating with the female. You see sperm competition. We already saw a first suggestion of that the other day. You see sperm racing each other and competing with each other and looking for Greenbeard sperm to cooperate with. It might be a relative. And as we'll eventually get to, you see sperm trying to kill each other if they are from different males. And all of that is very energetically demanding. Sperm in this sort of species have more mitochondria than sperm. And in this one, you're the only guy in the scene, and your 2.5 sperm that you have there, they've got all day to get to wherever they're going. And in contrast, in this case, these sperm are punching it out, and we're going to be seeing all sorts of toxins that sperm release that will kill sperm from another male, all sorts of competitive strategies with that. So you see that as well. Next, so we've got females choosing for different types of males. So in this case, if you mate with this guy, you have a kid, he is sticking around, you form a pair bond, a monogamous pair bond, and thus you have a choice. You have a choice reproductively, like you're a primate. Primates on average give birth to one kid at a time because they're very costly, all of that. Primates do that, but you're in a pair bonding species, and you know that if you get pregnant, who's going to stick around? There's going to be the pair raising the kids. What do you as a female want to do in terms of individual selection? Brilliant move. Have twins. Have twins. And as we will see in most of the pair bonding primate species on Earth, females twin. If you're one of these females and you give birth to two kids, you give birth to twins, what you're going to see is like one of them or both of them are going to starve to death because you're all on your own. So we see the pair bonding species, a tendency towards twinning. South American monkeys, tamarins, marmosets, which are all of these pair bonders, they always twin. They always twin, and there's some really interesting intra-womb stuff going on there that sets them up for cooperate. And both twins are going to survive. They grow up because they've got two parents doing that. In contrast, in these polygamous polyandrous species, you see females give birth to only one offspring at a time. This brings up one interesting sort of elaboration. There's something that you see in a lot of species, which is a term that's used. It's called bet hedging or het bedging or hedge betting or some such thing. Bet. Okay, so you're a female. Let's suppose you're a female in this sort of species where you're a bird. You lay one egg because you're not going to get any male help or whatever. Nonetheless, in some of these species, what you see is females will lay more eggs than they can eventually provide nutrients for. A mammal will give birth to more offspring than she could eventually provide milk for. All that. What a bizarre thing. You've just guaranteed one of your kids going to starve to death, or whoever the excesses are. What you're seeing there is bet hedging. This is a strategy that's often seen when there's a question, a possibility that, for example, a tough winter is coming. Put in more reproductive investment, put in more calories into your pregnancy to have a backup kid just in case the first one doesn't make it. And you see in a lot of species when times are unstable, you give birth to an excess number of offspring with the expectation that, like the runts of the litter, are going to starve to death, but just in case you lose the prince, the heir to the whole thing, at least you've got a backup. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a whole cluster of traits that totally logically go together in terms of individual selection aspects, reciprocal, altruism aspects. Do you form a stable cooperative pair? Do you not? What the physiological costs are of these different strategies? What final step? So you're female in each one of these species, and you have a choice. You have a strategy. You've given birth to a kid or kids, whatever the normal number is, the kind of species you were in. And here's the question. Do you abandon the kids to go mate with somebody else and start a second brood, start another grand scheme to enhance your reproductive success? If you do it in this sort of species and you bail out, your kids are not going to survive. If you do it in this sort of species and you bail out, the guy is still there and he's going to raise them. And thus what you see in a lot of these monogamous pair bonding species, you see female cuckoldry. Females will abandon the nest and go set up a second one with another male. That's a highly effective strategy for increasing reproductive success, as long as you know there's going to be somebody who's still going to be faithfully back at home raising the kids and paying orthodontist fees and things. So what we see here is simply going through the logic of what you would expect. We define two very different sorts of species here. And this is exactly what you see in lots and lots of different social species. They come in one of two profiles. First one, pair bonding species. South American monkeys, tamarins, marmosets, gibbons are pair bonders, all of that. And you see all of these traits going hand in hand. Hundreds of different bird species, and that's where you see the two swan together, the picture in the handout there. And you can't even tell which one is the female, which one is the male. Classic pair bonding monogamous species. In contrast, we have what is termed a tournament species. And this is one male lion with a whole female pride. This is like the male elephant seal. This is one male impala with this whole herd of female impalas, tournament species. And these are the characteristics you see. Lots of male-male aggression, lots of variance in male reproduction. Females are only choosing for good genes in males because they're getting nothing else out of that. Females mating with lots of different males, starting sperm wars, tournament species like these. And all you need to do is start at any given one of these points. So you've just discovered a new species, and you see in one of them, the male helps take care of the kids. Or you watch for 18 years and you never see a male helping to take care of the, and just from that observation alone, you can derive the rest of his traits. Bringing us back, dramatic fitting back to these guys, here we have a highly sexually dimorphic species. These are baboons. This is an adult female, about half the body size of an adult male. And look at this ridiculous secondary sexual character, these enormous canines that you don't find in the females. And a very cool thing here, just before the first premolar there's a gap there, and each time a male baboon lowers his teeth there, he grinds his teeth against the flat surface of there. He grinds his canines to sharpen them, and just before a fight, you will see two males standing there, pumping their jaws away, sharpening their teeth. And they fell out of the tree. This is all you know. And you know from this, you've got a tournament species, and you already know relatively like how many mitochondria this guy is likely to have as sperm. You already know that this is not a female who is willing to abandon her kid because he's going to do squat. All of this that you see here, just from starting with our first principles of what makes perfect sense, the traits you would expect to see. Oh, you might say, so what about humans? Which we will obviously be getting back to in a great more detail. What about humans? Where do humans fit into this? Are we a classic pair bonding species, as many people would have suggesting in their Sunday morning sermons? Are we a tournament polygamous polyandrous species? And we'll eventually get to this, but by every measure you can look at the degree of difference in typical body size, the degree of typical difference in life expectancy between sexes, all of that, looking cross-culturally, looking at genetics of what sort of diseases humans get, etc., what you see over and over and over is we humans are about halfway in between. We are the most flagrant exception to being a classic pair bonding species or a classic tournament species. We are somewhere in the middle by every measure we can get to, and we will get to that in these sex lectures down the lines of seeing right in the middle, we are a very confused species. And by those same measures, those same criteria, we are on the average in the middle, and certain individuals are much more in one direction than the other. I don't need to tell you about this, but we will be looking at that in far more detail. Okay, now the next thing we're going to make sense of along these similar lines, applying our principles, is, as I noted at the beginning of the class the other day, just as a heads up, this is discussing infanticide as a evolutionary strategy, all of that. So if that's going to be very distressing. But we have here an amazing piece of sort of primatology history. In the mid-70s, a primatologist named Sarah Hrdy, who was at Harvard at the time, was studying langur monkeys in India. And she came back and reported something that would have made Marlon Perkins turn over in his grave. I don't know even if he was in his grave at that point, but he would have quickly been with what she was reporting, which is she came back with very careful documentation of something that simply could not occur in like normal animals. It was absolutely out of the question that this could occur naturally. She came back and reported that among her langur monkeys, occasionally male langurs would kill babies. Whoa, she's imagining it, she's making it up, everyone first initially said. Okay, well, no. People want to document it. Then the next explanation was in India, a lot of monkeys are tolerated there. Who's the monkey god in Hinduism? I can't remember, but monkeys are held sacred. So there's monkeys in all sorts of human settings, urban settings, villages, towns, etc. And living around humans, everyone said at this point, somehow made them crazy and pathological, and induced all sorts of pathological behavior. And that's why you would occasionally see males killing babies. Hrdy came back and said, no, that's nonsense. I was actually studying them in a mountain reserve. There's no humans nearby, a place called Mount Abu. And everyone said, this can't be because animals behave for the good of the species. Even though this was the mid-70s, basically every tenured primatologist on Earth was still of the group selection generation, and they were rejecting her observation. And then they got around to, oh, well, some males are just psychotic. There's something wrong with them that they're doing this. And what Hrdy very carefully documented turned out to be something that occurs in dozens of different species, what is now known as competitive infanticide. Certain parameters by which you see this in a particular species. First off, you only see competitive infanticide in tournament species. You've got a male with a bunch of females. Classic tournament. Classic polygamy. This male is fathering kids with all these females. As is typically the case, and this is a lion, male lion with his pride, gazelle, all of that, as is typically the case, there is a limited tenure for the resident male. And with some regularity, some outside male comes in, kicks him out, and takes over. This outside male has been solitary. That's what you find with orangutans, or the male has been living with a bunch of other males, what are called bachelor herds among gazelle and impala. But one guy shows up, kicks this guy out, and takes over. So that's the next requirement. Tournament species in which there's been a turnover of who the resident male is. And now the critical requirement, which initially sounds abstract as hell, but where it's got to be that the average tenure of the resident male is shorter than the average interbirth interval of females. What's that? What is that? Where on the average, the length of time this guy is going to be there before he gets booted out is shorter than the average span of time between females reproducing, the average interbirth interval. What does that mean? That means you're this guy, you've been like taking anabolic steroids for years and working out at the gym, and finally you take over, and oh no, all of the females are pregnant or have a newborn kid and are nursing or whatever, and they're not going to be ovulating again for years, and you're going to be long gone by then. If the average length of time of this guy is short enough that if females are pregnant or have young kids or whatever, he's going to be gone before he has a chance to enhance his individual selection, leave more copies of his genes. When you see a species where that's the case, what is the brutally logical thing for the male to do at that point? Kill the kids. Kill the babies. Why is that advantageous for his genetic plans? for two reasons. First off, by doing that, he is decreasing the reproductive success of the prior male who he has just booted out. But more importantly, if these females' kids are killed, they stop nursing, they stop lactating, and they start ovulating again, and they suddenly become fertile again and go into estrus. That's his logic. And what you see is that happens in all sorts of species out there. Langur monkeys. Lions do that. When a male is booted out of the pride by another male, he will go about trying to kill the kids. Hamsters. Hamsters are nomadic tournament species. So you have a male who gets booted out and a new one comes in. And you all know from if you were not careful with your hamster pets or such, a new male will eat the kids, will kill the previous babies because he just showed up and there's some other. You see infanticide along these lines. And this has now been documented, I think, in the clearest example out there of why group selection doesn't work. Animals behaving for the good of the species. You see competitive infanticide in one of the most endangered species on this planet, mountain gorillas. Mountain gorillas have this social structure. The average tenure is shorter than the interbirth interval, and every now and then a new male will come in, a new silverback, and he will kill the kids in there, and this is a species on the edge of extinction. This is not anyone behaving for the good of the species. This is this individual with his selfish genes trying to maximize the number of copies of genes he leaves in the next generation, while ever so slightly adding to the likelihood that they're all going to go extinct. So you have this competitive infanticide. You then see a subtler version of it, which is you're this new male and you show up, and that's what you do with respect to the kids. And this has now been seen. Hurdy is like a senior figure in the field. She's emeritus now at UC Davis, and she spawned this whole field of 40, 50 different species where people see competitive infanticide along these lines here. So, one additional thing. You're this new male, you show up, like this female that have kids there, and you go about killing them to your own Darwinian advantage there. What do you do for the females who are pregnant? What you do is you harass them, you stress them, you attack them to the point that they miscarry. You harass them to that point that their pregnancy terminates, and thus they're going to start ovulating again sometime soon. And you see this in a variety of species. Gelada baboons do that, where the new male will harass pregnant females. Wild horses, you see that a new male will stress females to the point of stress-induced miscarriage, and that's part of the logic of it as well. Okay, so that's totally logical of males going about their evolutionary behavior. So you're a female. What do you think of all of this? What's your individual fitness and Darwinian interests about with this? Well, if you're a female, this totally sucks because there's a chance your kid is going to get killed. What do? Obviously, you try to defend the kid. And often females, for example, among langur monkeys, females will attempt to fight off the new male coming in to keep him from being infanticidal. So now you, as the female, have an evolutionary choice. Are you willing to sustain, say, a serious injury, death even, to save this child from this infanticidal male? And the answer is, it depends. If you're a young female, you have a huge reproductive potential ahead of you. In other words, it makes no sense for you to fight to the death to protect your kid because you've got 3, 4, 5 kids ahead of you in the future there. What that predicts is females will fight off the male only to a certain extent, and the younger the female, parentheses, the more reproductive future she has ahead of her, the sooner she will give up and say, okay, cutting my losses. So now let's generate a kin selection prediction from that. So you have a young female and she's gonna defend, but only to a certain point. Who on the scene there has an amazingly strong incentive to protect the kid because she has no future reproductive potential on her own? The grandmother. And what you see is grandmothers in these cases will defend and fight off infanticidal males to the point of them being killed in the process. And that's their logic. With the females, in contrast to the mothers, older mothers will fight the male off for longer. Younger ones give up sooner. It's the grandmothers who do the more defensive behavior. Then you see these females don't just have this, making lemonade from lemon strategy that, okay, at least, I'm still young and kids ahead of me or whatever. They've got some other tricks up their sleeve. One of the most clever ones, and this is observed in a number of monkey species that's shown competitive infanticide, which is the new male shows up, you're pregnant, and if this guy has any brains, he's going to know that, like, as soon as you give birth, that's the previous guy's kid, all of that. You do this brilliant physiological adaptation. You go into what would be termed a pseudoestrus. You give all the external cues, you give all the pheromonal cues to this male that you, in fact, are ovulating. You aren't really, you're going into a fake estrus, but females go through the physiological sort of mechanisms there of seemingly being an estrus. And what's that about? You're seemingly fertile there. You're not really, you're pregnant, but you're seemingly fertile. You mate with the guy, and he's an idiot. He's an idiot because, a week later you give birth, and he says, whoa, let's see, what's the gestation period for my species? It's about 5 months. I've been here 1 week, and whoa, already I'm a father. Whoa, what a guy. What can I say? You've got the males don't understand gynecology and obstetrics in their species, and they get suckered into it. When females go into pseudoestrus and mate with a male at that point, he is less likely to be infanticidal when they eventually give birth, because males know nothing about this. You could then see an additional thing that happens, showing the cognition that's going into this. And by the time we're getting to primates, primates are thinking about what the circumstance means. They may not be thinking clearly, and here's an example of this. So Hurdy, actually, I think it was one of her students, observed this once, where a male came in, booted out this guy and started being infanticidal. And then, whoa, major comeback. This guy came back, booted him out again for a few weeks. And then this guy came back and booted him. And at that point, the males obviously couldn't keep track of how long have I been here and who did I do with what and when did I know it and how long are we pregnant for and all that. And the males stopped being infanticidal because they couldn't figure out what they're supposed to be doing at that point. So you've got the pseudoestrus on the part of females as a good defensive strategy to foil these infanticidal males. There's another strategy that's possible as well. So you're a pregnant female, and in this case, this was observed in gelada baboons, another baboon species. That's not as great as the baboons that I study, but nonetheless, gelada baboons, where they have competitive infanticide. And what you see is that a new male comes in and he will start harassing pregnant females. The evolutionary goal being to harass them to the point of miscarriage. But they noticed something interesting, which is pregnant females miscarried before they were even being harassed by this new male. What's that about? That turns out not to be male harassment as part of his infanticidal strategy. That turns out to be an adaptive cutting your losses strategy on the part of the females, which is, okay, I got a choice at this point. I can spend a gazillion more calories going through pregnancy to full term, and then the kid's going to be killed, or I can spontaneously abort at this point. And what is seen is that is what happens with them, not because they're being harassed, not because they have elevated stress hormone levels, but it's in fact an internal mechanism that triggers spontaneous miscarriage there. And you see the same thing in some other species to a remarkably subtle extent in hamsters. Once again, infanticidal species, male shows up, all of that, and you've got females, pregnant females, and they don't need harassment for this to happen. They don't even need the male to show up. The smell of a novel male will cause pregnant females to miscarry. Because by definition, if they're smelling a novel adult male, it means the resident guy has gone, has been kicked out. By definition, that means they're going to be in trouble. It's done entirely with pheromones. It's something called the Bruce Parks effect, named for Bruce and Parks, who've exactly shown how the pheromonal smell, the odor of a novel male, will trigger a sufficient rise in stress hormones and messing up prolactin, and you get spontaneous miscarriage in the females. Okay, let's think like kin selectionists. The smell of what male would not trigger this? And if the male is a close relative of the male who kicks him out, and we'll be seeing by next week why close relatives smell similarly. They're less likely to spontaneously miscarry, and when they have kids, he is less likely to try to kill the kids out of the kin selection thing. Okay, so we see this female strategy of saying, my God, why bother with the rest of pregnancy if I'm just going to lose the kids afterward? And in the Gelada study, what was shown was as follows. Okay, you take your average female, and after she gives birth, on the average, it's 2.5 years before she comes pregnant again. That's the length of time for a kid to develop and wean them, and you start ovulating and all of that. In contrast, we have females who, when a new infanticidal male shows up, they're pregnant and they go full term. Full term, they give birth to the kid who is then killed by the infanticidal male. What's their average interbirth interval? 3.5 years. Here are the ones who, as soon as a new male shows up, have spontaneous miscarriages, and their interbirth interval is only a few months longer than here. It's the length of time they've been pregnant. In contrast, here it's the length of time for full-length pregnancy plus the additional stress effects. So this showing here, this is in fact an adaptive strategy on the part of females. Okay, another domain to make sense of, building around a lot of these same principles here. So you are a male in a pair bonding species. You're a male marmoset, you're a male swan, you're a male gull, whatever, gibbon, any of those. You're a male on a pair bonding species. So you are mating with a female, and she is now pregnant, and you have a choice. You want your kid obviously to wind up surviving, being born, being successful, all that, passing on lots of copies of their genes. Would you be willing to have your kid intrauterine, that fetus of yours, be so aggressively hungry and all of that, that the offspring takes so many calories from the female that it screws up her future reproductive potential because she's totally exhausted from this and depleted, but the kid is very likely to live and survive. Would you want that? No, because any future kids this female is going to have is going to be with you. You have to balance your desire to optimize your current offspring to survive with your own future reproductive potential with the same female. In contrast, if you are in one of those tournament species, you are this male who's just shown up, you're a nomadic male hamster, and after mating, you're never going to be heard from again. If you had a choice in the matter, would you want your offspring in this pregnant female to be so good at taking calories and nutrients out of that female circulation that they're going to do great? And unfortunately, as a downside, the female is going to be so metabolically exhausted by the time she gives birth that decreases her future fertility. Great idea. Because who cares? I'm long gone. I have no investment in this female's future reproductive potential. And in fact, given that she'd be mating in the future with a different male, this is a good idea. In fact, I want an offspring of mine to be as metabolically demanding as a fetus as possible. Whereas in a pair bonding species, I, the male, obviously want my kid to get enough nutrients in there, but not so much that it majorly compromises our shared future reproductive potential as a pair. Okay, so that in theory, so what kind of fetus does a male want to give rise to? All of that. And it turns out this exactly works this way. In tournament species, there are genes that are male derived that push for faster fetal growth, that pushes for more efficient absorption of nutrients out of the bloodstream from the female circulation, from mom's circulation, the genes that are involved in more release of insulin like growth factors, which makes the fetus grow faster, and that's taking a bigger metabolic bite out of this female, but you don't care as long as the kid is born and survive. You don't care what this does to the female down the line. In contrast, in pair bonding species, males don't have these genes that have these effects on their offspring. So you're the female, and what's your notion of all of this? What you want to do is, yeah, you want this pregnancy, if you're in the tournament species, you want this pregnancy to go okay, but not at the cost of your future reproductive potential. And what you do in those species, you have a gene whose actions counteracts the gene from the male that is pushing for more fetal growth. The male, for example, and this has now been sorted out, a guy at Harvard named David Haig worked this all out, showing the male-derived genes are pushing for more fetal growth by way of higher levels of this hormone insulin like growth factor. And the female response is just to have a gene for the receptor for this hormone and a receptor that's not very responsive to it. So male is pushing for more fetal growth with this growth hormone. Female responds with something that slows it down. And you get this arms race going on there. You get this intersexual competition happening in species like these tournament species, built around the fact that the female is certainly interested in her present investment and her future reproductive success, but is balancing it with the future, whereas this male has no interest and no care at all in her future. You see this genetic battle that goes on in the fetus between male-derived genes that push for more fetal growth and female-derived ones that counter it, and this arms race that happens there. And what people have since found is some of these male-derived genes are active in the brain and postnatally push for a kid who is going to be a more effective, more avid nurser, getting more nutrients from mom, increasing the likelihood of surviving. And mom has genes that are also expressed in the kid's hypothalamus that tend to counter that. All of this is this conflict going on. So something should be coming to mind immediately. Wait a second. The gene from the father does this, whereas the gene from the mother does that. Mendel, wait, we're just learning about Mendel right now. We're remembering it, or we knew about it all along, which is you get equal number of genes from each parent, and it doesn't matter whether you get this particular eye color gene from the mother or the father. That's not how, and yet here we have genes that are working differently depending on whether they came from the mother or the father. And this ushered in this whole field about 25 years ago, which completely undid classic Mendelism, Mendelian genetics, showing that there's a small subset of genes where it matters which parent you get it from. And these are termed imprinted genes. And when you get a gene from the father that pushes for increased fetal growth, the mother has the exact same gene, but it's silenced in her. And when she has a gene that codes for kind of a sloppy, unresponsive growth factor, growth hormone receptor, the male has the same gene, but his is silenced. Parent-specific, sex-specific inheritance of these imprinted genes. And you see a wild example of this in humans, having to do with male-derived genes that are imprinted and this is a tiny percentage of genes that are imprinted in this way. Male-derived ones that push for more fetal growth, female ones that do the opposite. So suppose you've got a mutation in the male-derived gene that pushes for strong fetal growth, and it's knocked out. What do you get as a result? You don't get implantation. You get egg being fertilized, but it doesn't implant because it's lacking genes that are urging you on to implant and have a nice thick uterus and all of that. And the female slow down gene signal is unopposed because of the mutation in the male. In those cases, you see implantation doesn't occur. How about the other way? Suppose there's a mutation in the female slow down gene, and that's not there, and instead you just get the male-derived imprinted genes that are pushing for major rapid growth. You get one of the all-time nightmare types of cancers called a choriocarcinoma. The chorionic tissue in the uterus there winds up growing out of control after fertilization because it's just the male-derived imprinted genes saying, grow more, divide more, grow more, take more energy, and the female counter efforts are blocked, and you get this hugely fatal type of cancer, reproductive system. So we see here even this like competition, intersexual wars playing out in tournament species, and none of that happening in monogamous species. So right now you should be on the edge of your seat saying, wait a second, I just described two different diseases that happen with mutations in imprinted human genes. One version, you get failure of implantation, and the other, you get a type of cancer. There's two developmental disorders where you see this, where there's a mutation in one of the female imprinted genes in the hypothalamus or one of the male imprinted ones, and I forget which is which, but one of them is called Prader-Willi syndrome. The other one is called Angelman syndrome. And these are pretty severe developmental disorders. You're saying, wait a second, we're talking about human diseases here. Are we pair bonding or are we tournament or whatever? And here's one of those fascinating things that tells you about a species. How many imprinted genes do you find in this species? If there's a lot of them, you're looking at a tournament species. If there's none of them, you're looking at a pair bonder. Humans, we've got some, but not many. We're about halfway in between. So that same business, again, about us being in the middle. Okay, few more things and few other phenomena. Every now and then you see a male baboon who's low ranking, who's about to get trounced by a high ranking male. And what does he do? He looks around in a panic and he grabs a baby and holds it. What's that about? Marlon Perkins knows exactly what that's about. Animals behave for the good of the species, and this threatening male isn't going to hurt him because, oh, he's got a baby and it's such a cute baby. And you look more closely, and once you get rid of group selection thinking, you see something interesting, which is when this guy grabs a baby because he's about to be trounced, he doesn't grab just any baby. He grabs a baby who is most likely to be the offspring of the guy threatening him. And this is now termed as kidnapping. Mess with me and your kid is going to get it. And what you often see is that will deter the male from attacking. How do you know this is what's going on? You've got a high-ranking male who's been high-ranking there for 3 years or so. He's threatening somebody who kidnaps one of the kids. The high-ranking male says, whoa, that could well be my kid, or it's more likely to be my kid than his. Maybe I shouldn't attack. You see a high-ranking male who only recently showed up in the group a few months before, and he can't be the father. He is not deterred by kidnapping. More things that go on. Nepotism, ranking systems, it makes perfect sense as well from our standpoint of kin selection, and I'm just doing this as an opportunity to play with these little naggard things. So you see female baboons. You will have an alpha female, this matriarch, all of that, and she has a daughter. Her first child, she has a daughter, and that daughter is destined to grow up to be number 2 in the hierarchy. And she has another daughter, And she's going to wind up being number 3 in the hierarchy, and everybody gets shifted down. And when this daughter has a daughter, she's going to wind up in between the two there, and it's just like royalty and princess, what's her name in England, or and you see, and meanwhile, in a low-ranking lineage, you've got the matriarch there. When she has a daughter, her daughter will get one step below. Nepotism, completely predicting ranking systems here based on kin selection. Another phenomenon, sex ratios in populations. On the average, humans, all sorts of other species, what you see is, on the average, it oscillates around 50-50. And we see a case of frequency-dependent selection. If there's a shortage of females, you want to have a daughter. If there's a shortage of males, so you've got oscillating around the mean, the more popular something becomes, the less popular it should remain, and that sort of thing. But then you see something interesting superimposed on that by asking a very bizarre question. So you're female and you're about to get pregnant. Who do you want? Do you want a daughter or do you want a son? So we look at a tournament species, and what we saw before is with males, there's tremendous variance in male reproductive success. You could have a son who's a high-ranking elephant seal and he's going to leave a gazillion but 95% of the males are never going to reproduce at all. Males are risky to have if you want your offspring to be fruitful and multiply. On the other hand, with females, by the time you get to mammals and the cost of pregnancy, the most fertile and the least fertile females will differ by just a few numbers of copies. Females are a safer investment. And what you then would say is, okay, if the ecosystem is bad, if there's a drought, if things are tough these days, let's be conservative. Let's go for a female. If times are good, let's gamble. Let's go for a male. And you see this in all sorts of mammalian species where the quality of the ecosystem will shift the sex ratio of births. Another thing that plays into it, forget what the ecosystem is like. You're a high-ranking female. Your kid is going to be great and get all the nutrition and do wonderfully, and maybe that's a good idea. Let's gamble on a male. And what you see and superimposed on that is a rank difference. High-ranking females in species where there isn't strong nepotism, where your daughter is going to do great, but high-ranking females in other sorts of species, when they're high-ranking, they've got to skew towards more male offspring. So you say, that's cool, that's very interesting. How do you control who the sex of your kid is going to be? And the way that is done is a very simple trick. Male fetuses are more expensive than female fetuses. They're bigger, they grow faster, they have more metabolic demands, so that you see every step of the way, if you're high-ranking and doing wonderfully in all of that, you've got the nutrients for a male fetus to survive. On the other hand, if you're low-ranking, not as well fed, if there's a drought, whatever, male fetuses are less likely to survive. And this plays out in humans. You see, when you look at the ratio of Y chromosome sperm that are going to code for a male versus X, when you see the ratio of them, normally in humans, there's about 110 male sperm for every 100 female. By the time you look at fertilization, already the fact that male sperm are more costly or less likely to actually work with fertilization, the ratio is down a little bit. By third trimester, further down, by birth in humans, it's roughly 103 males for every 100 females. By early adolescence, it's evened out. And then you see the universal pattern across human cultures, which is males die sooner than females. And by the time you look across the planet at the elderly, anywhere ranging from 60 to 80 elderly men for every 100 elderly women. This is the mechanism for it. This is how it's done. Okay, so all of this is great. We have seen a ton now about how all of this stuff works. A couple more examples. If you're a prairie dog and you give an alarm call, you pay attention first to see which relatives are around. If there's none, you're less likely to give an alarm call and cause attention to yourself. There's this phenomenon it's very rare in all sorts of tournament species. What's very common there is polygamy. One male mates with a lot of different females. Every now and then you see the reversal, polyandry, where one female mates with a lot of males. And in virtually every case where this has been seen out there in the animal kingdom, what you see is what's called adelphic polyandry. The two males are brothers. This was first observed in lions at a much higher than chance level. If there's two males in a pride rather than the usual just one, significantly higher than chance that those two males are going to be brothers, or at least close relatives. Where you see polyandrous systems, the multiple males are usually related. And in the handout, I give you one example, one of the few cases of cultural polyandry in humans, and this is found in Tibet and Nepal. And there's a whole ecological explanation for why you wind up with one woman having half a dozen different husbands simultaneously, but they're always brothers, ranging from the brother who's about your age down to a newborn infant younger brother, and they are all formally your husbands. And there are cultural reasons why this makes sense ecologically, for much the same reason that you see adelphic polyandry in these other species. When you have females mating with multiple males, with males who are willing to maintain stable versions of this, kin selection, they're close relatives. Okay, last topic here. So what we've now done is totally trashed group selection, and we now have our building blocks here of how things really work. And then, just when people were getting group selection out of the textbooks, in the 80s, 90s, suddenly group selection came back, but in a different version, and a scientifically valid one, and what's been called neo-group selection. And this was all the work of this guy, David Sloan Wilson, State University of New York at Binghamton, who labored in like obscurity for years, saying, wait a second, there's some circumstances where group selection, no, I'm not saying Marlon Perkins and Wynne Edwards from 1960, I'm saying a different sort, but every now and then there is actually group selection, and everyone said he's an idiot and ignored him, and he was sort of a voice crying in the wilderness. What was neo-group selection like according to this Wilson here? You have a circumstance where individual A will dominate individual B. But Wilson said if you have a circumstance where you have a group of individual Bs, nonetheless will outcompete a group of individual As, you're going to have selection on the group level here and selection for the Bs. What does this sound like? The very first spontaneous cooperator is an idiot and gets selected against. The very first group of collective cooperators will outcompete them. And he showed a first classic example of this. You take bunches of chickens, a whole bunch of different groups of chickens, and in each one of those groups there's going to be one female who lays the most eggs. And why does she lay the most? Because she's a bully. She pecks and harasses the other females into infertility. So you've got one A in each of these groups out competing these various females. Now, what Wilson did was he assembled this like all-star team of female chickens. He took the most fertile female in each one of these groups and put them together in a group. And what happened with them? They all were pecking each other and attacking each other so aggressively that they all aggressed each other into infertility, and suddenly groups of bees were out reproducing them. And people slowly came around to the fact that, well, yeah, I guess this makes sense. And what their conclusion was, to nonetheless not deal with it, is this is still a very, very rare event. You don't often see circumstances where selection occurs on the level of a group for a trait that would be disadvantageous in an individual, but is advantageous on a collectivist level. And what you can guess right now is people have realized, whoa, actually that happens with some frequency, and it happens with great frequency in the most interesting species out there, us. We have versions of neo-group selection all the time where the meek, plural, will inherit the earth, oh, even though any individual, meekest individual, will be done in there by any individual bully. All sorts of circumstances where in species, but especially us, you get group selection playing out on this level, which is a world away from the 1960s version of I give up my life for you, mein Kinder, and throw yourself to the crocodiles. So this ushered in this like period where people kind of had to admit the guy was right. And the most consequential person who admitted this guy was right was the Harvard zoologist E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson, who was not related to David Sloan Wilson, and E.O. Wilson had spent decades as one of the architects of modern evolution of behavior, saying, that's ridiculous. Oh, come on, stop it with your group selection. Sounds like you're from 1960. In his 80s, as an old man, E.O. Wilson said, you know what? Actually, I was wrong about this. This type of neo group selection is for real and interesting and in a remarkable thing. This Wilson and David Sloan Wilson published a long theoretical paper together, which basically consisted of E.O. Wilson saying over and over, I was wrong. I was actually kind of wrong. He was right. This can happen sometime. Amazing paper, scientifically, amazing vindication of the very tough, resilient David Sloan Wilson. Amazing demonstration when you have an 80-year-old giant in the field who is willing to issue a major paper saying, I was wrong. Now, what this ushered in as our final concept here is the notion that, sometimes you have selection on the individual level, sometimes on the kin level, sometimes on the group level, this concept now termed multi-level selection. Sometimes the most pertinent level of selection is for an individual gene, gene-centered selection, a selfish gene. Sometimes selection is on the level of the whole genome. Sometimes the selection is on the level of who the individual winds up looking like on the phenotypic level. And sometimes selection is on the group level, multi-level selection. Here's the sort of metaphor that's always used. So, genotype versus phenotype. People with the catch-up stuff, hopefully you'll soon be comfortable with this. Genotype, what's your genome? What are the individual genes? Phenotype, what do you look like? Here's the metaphor that's always used. Does selection occur on the level of genotype? You go into a bakery and you buy a cake on the basis of its recipe or on the basis of its phenotype. You buy it on the basis of how it tastes. So now with multi-level selection, gene-centered selection, do you go in and you buy a cake based on a single ingredient? Genome level selection, do you buy the cake based on its entire list of ingredients? Phenotypic level, do you buy it on the basis of its taste? And then what Wilson ushered in, is Sloan Wilson, was this group selection level. Sometimes we buy cakes not because of the ingredient or the ingredients, but sometimes you buy it not even for its taste, but for who's selling it. Because of some Greenbeard property, and sometimes you buy it because they're a person who's like you. They're a member of your group. The examples I give, there used to be this bakery in Oakland called Black Muslim Bakery. And if you were buying stuff from there, you were definitely making a statement. If you were buying stuff from Uber Christian Hobby Lobby, you were making a statement. Sometimes selection is just on this group level for shared Greenbeard properties. By the time we get to humans, what you're going to see is we're so smart and individualistic that none of these models apply cleanly to us. None of them apply cleanly by the time you're getting to like other apes and stuff. We're too complicated. And we are not based on any single model of any other species. So this is great. Here's a whole model of thinking that explains everything in the universe, except that there's all sorts of criticisms of this style of thought, built along 3 lines. The first one is, over and over, this stuff only makes sense if you can show that there's a genetic basis. If we're talking evolution, you're talking genes. Show me the genes. Show me the genes for your infanticidal strategy, or deciding this would be a good time to have a spontaneous miscarriage. Show me the genes for it, which is what next week is going to be mostly about. The next problem is what's called an adaptationist argument. Ooh, here I see something with animals and I've got to make up a story, a just so story. Why it makes perfect sense that we evolved to be this way. That makes wonderful sense. Great example of this historically is chins. Humans have chins. No other primates have chins. And this adaptive just so story, ooh, if you see a trait, it must have evolved for some purpose. So chins must be useful to us for some reason. Chins, you can use sharpened chins as weapons in male-male conflict, or you can use a sharp chin to get food crumbs out from the corner of the floor. And people figured out, the human skull, the face is more this way, the front and the jaw, and if you're going to have like a human skull, you're going to get a chin there. It's not there for a reason. It's just baggage. The term in the field that you will see in the outline is called a spandrel. Not everything evolved because it was selected for and good for you. Final thing is, all of this is built around the notion of gradual evolution over time. And what we'll see by next week and the week after is sometimes evolution has long periods of nothing happening and then a sudden abrupt change. Jumps, punctuated jumps. And if that's the case, all the stuff we've been hearing about this week, for every little bit of competitive advantage makes a difference, most of the time it doesn't make any difference at all because most of the time it's static. Final point, this whole approach has also been criticized along political grounds by a lot of leftist scientists who say, isn't it interesting that this is a whole system that says over and over competition and dominance and hierarchy and all of that, and why can't we have an emphasis instead on evolution is not about capitalist flavored styles of optimal strategy. Evolution is not like Wall Street. And that's been one of the criticisms also. Show me the genes. What do genes actually do? How do they evolve? And do any of them actually explain any of this just so story stuff there?